My name is Gerald Whitmore, and I'm 64 years old. I live in a two-story house in Guelph, Ontario, the same house where my 3 children grew up, where they learned to ride bikes on the driveway, where we carved pumpkins every October and hung stockings every December. I want to be clear about something before I tell you this story. I am not a perfect man, but I was always a present one. Before we get into what happened last Thanksgiving, let me know in the comments, where are you listening from right now, and what time is it there? I always love knowing who's with me. I retired 2 years ago after 31 years working as a mechanical engineer for a manufacturing company in Waterloo. My wife Patricia passed away 6 years ago from ovarian cancer. Losing her was the kind of thing that changes every room in your house. The kitchen sounds different. The hallway feels longer. Sunday mornings become something you have to survive rather than enjoy. But I kept going. I cooked. I gardened. I stayed in the house because leaving it felt like abandoning her somehow. My 3 children are Daniel, who is 41 and lives in Mississauga with his wife Karen and their 2 kids. My daughter Renee, 38, lives in Calgary. She moved there about 10 years ago for work and never came back. And my youngest, my son Philippe, 34, lives in Ottawa with his girlfriend. Philippe is the one I always thought understood me best. He used to sit with me in the garage while I worked on the old Pontiac. He knew the names of every tool before he was 10. For the first few years after Patricia died, Thanksgiving was still something we shared. It wasn't perfect. Renee was often flying in and out. Daniel's wife Karen had a way of redirecting conversations that I found exhausting, but we were together. The table had noise, and the house smelled like roast turkey and sage stuffing and Patricia's cranberry recipe that I had learned to make myself. Then things shifted. Slowly at first, the way these things always do. 3 years ago, Daniel started talking about money. Not in a warm way, not the way families talk about planning for the future or helping each other out. He started asking questions. About the house, about my pension from the company, my CPP, my RRSP, about what I intended to do with things eventually. He said it was because he wanted to help me plan. I am an engineer. I had been planning my own finances since before Daniel was born. I didn't need help, but I answered his questions because he was my son. 2 years ago, Renee joined the conversation. She called one evening in February not to check on me, I realized, but to tell me that she and Daniel had talked, and they both thought I should consider selling the Guelph house because it was too much for one person, and that the equity could be useful redistributed. Redistributed, that was her word. She's a project manager. Everything is a resource to be allocated. I told her I wasn't ready to sell. She told me that at my age I had to be practical. I told her I was 62 and still shoveled my own driveway. The call ended coldly. Philippe didn't say anything either way that year, but he also didn't push back on his siblings. He just went quiet in the way that means someone has already chosen a side and is hoping you won't notice. I spent the following year in a kind of low-grade grief that I didn't have a name for. I wasn't angry. I was confused. I kept replaying moments, Daniel's wedding, where I gave a speech that made half the room cry. Renee's university graduation, where I drove 14 hours to surprise her. Philippe's first apartment, where I spent a weekend building his IKEA furniture because his hands had never quite learned patience. I thought these things had meant something. Last summer, I started seeing a counselor, a man named Dr. Abubakar, about my age, who worked out of a small office near the university. I'm not someone who talks easily about feelings, but he had a way of sitting with silence that made it less uncomfortable. He asked me once, "Gerald, when did you first feel like your children were looking through you rather than at you?" I sat with that question for a long time. By October, I had made a decision. Thanksgiving was coming the second Monday, the way it always is in Canada, and I decided to invite all 3 of them for the long weekend. Not out of desperation, not to force anything. I genuinely wanted one more real attempt. I cooked for 3 days. I ordered a 22-pound turkey from a local farm in Fergus. I made Patricia's stuffing from memory. I bought a good bottle of Niagara Peninsula Cabernet Franc that I'd been saving. I set the dining room table with the good dishes, the ones from our wedding registry that Patricia insisted we actually use and not keep for special occasions only, because she used to say, every Sunday you're all alive is a special occasion. I set 8 places at the table. Daniel confirmed 2 weeks before. Karen and the kids were coming. Renee said she'd book a flight. Philippe said he'd drive down Friday night. The Wednesday before Thanksgiving, I got a text from Renee. "Change of plans, Dad. Flights got complicated. Going to skip this year. Sorry." No phone call. No explanation of which flights. Which complications. A text message, like canceling a dentist appointment. I called her. She didn't answer. I left a voicemail that I kept short and calm. Thursday morning, Thanksgiving morning, I still hadn't heard from Daniel or Philippe. At 9 o'clock, I texted Daniel to confirm what time they'd arrive. He read the message. The 2 gray check marks turned blue. He didn't reply. I stood in my kitchen watching the turkey I'd put in at 6 that morning. The house smelled extraordinary. The table was set. The wine was breathing. At 11:30, Philippe texted, "Hey Dad, really sorry. Karen and Daniel are actually going to her parents' place in Oakville this year, and Renee's not coming either. So we figured it didn't make sense to drive all the way to Guelph just for the 2 of us. Hope that's okay. Maybe we can do something at Christmas? Hope that's okay." I put the phone face down on the counter. I stood there for a moment looking at the window above the sink, at the backyard where the oak tree had dropped most of its leaves, at the garden beds I'd put to sleep for the winter. I thought about Patricia. I thought about what she would have said. She would not have cried. She would have gotten very quiet, and then she would have said something precise and final. She had that gift. What I did not know yet, what I found out 3 days later, was that while I was standing in my kitchen alone on Thanksgiving morning, my 3 children were in a group text together. Daniel's wife, Karen, had organized a long weekend trip to a cottage near Huntsville, in Muskoka. All 3 of my kids were there. Renee had flown into Toronto on Wednesday evening. Philippe had driven up Friday, not down to Guelph, up to Muskoka. They were together, at a rented cottage with a hot tub and a dock, and, based on the photos I eventually saw, very good weather for October. They chose each other. They chose a rented cottage. And no one thought to invite me, or to tell me the truth, or to pick up the phone. I found out because a woman named Sylvia, who is Renee's oldest friend and someone I've known since Renee was in middle school, called me that Sunday evening. She thought I was at the cottage too. She called my number by mistake, trying to reach Renee. When I told her where I actually was, there was a silence on her end of the line that told me everything. "Gerald," she said carefully, "I'm so sorry. I assumed you were all together." I thanked her for calling and told her it wasn't her fault and wished her a good evening. Then I sat down in the armchair in the living room, Patricia's chair, the one by the window, and I stayed there for a long time. I want to tell you what that feels like, because I think some of you already know. It's not explosive. It doesn't hit you like a shock. It's more like something you suspected has finally been confirmed, and the confirmation is both a relief and a devastation at the same time. You think, I wasn't wrong, and then immediately, I wish I had been wrong. I didn't call any of them that night. I called Dr. Abubakar on Tuesday and told him what had happened. He listened without interrupting, which is what I needed. At the end he said, "What do you want to do, Gerald? Not what should you do. Not what's the right thing. What do you want to do?" I thought about that question for the rest of the week. Here's what I knew. I own my home outright, no mortgage. Patricia and I paid it off in 2009. The house is currently assessed at just over $870,000. I also have a defined benefit pension from my 31 years of service, a healthy RRSP, and a non-registered investment account. I had written a will 8 years ago with a lawyer in town, and in that will I had divided everything equally among the 3 children. I had also named Daniel as executor. I called my lawyer on the Thursday after Thanksgiving. Her name is Margaret Chen, and she has handled my legal affairs for over a decade. I asked her to review my will with me. I told her I was considering changes. She was professional and thorough, as she always is. We met the following Tuesday. In Ontario, unlike some other jurisdictions, there is no forced heirship for adult children, no legal requirement to leave anything to grown children who are financially independent. My children are all employed adults with their own incomes, their own assets, their own lives. I had no legal obligation to leave them anything. What I had given them was a choice I made freely, out of love. Love, I was realizing, that had not been particularly well tended on the other end. I made several changes. I removed Daniel as executor and appointed Margaret's firm in that role instead. I established a charitable bequest, a meaningful portion of the estate, to 2 organizations, the Guelph Food Bank, which Patricia had volunteered with for 12 years, and a hospice foundation that cared for her in her final weeks. The remainder was restructured as well. I did not disinherit my children completely. That's not who I am. But what they would receive was significantly different from what they had been counting on. I know they had been counting on it because Daniel had asked me twice in the past year to put his name on the deed just for estate planning purposes. I had declined, politely, both times. I want to be honest with you about something. Making those changes did not feel good, exactly. It felt like cutting something that had already been mostly severed, still painful, even when necessary. I drove home from Margaret's office and sat in the driveway for a few minutes before going inside. The house felt the same as it always does, the oak tree in the backyard, the front porch where Patricia used to sit with her tea in the morning. Nothing about the house had changed, but I had changed. Something had finished, and something else had started. 3 weeks after Thanksgiving, Daniel called me on a Saturday morning. Small talk first. How was I doing? How was the weather in Guelph? Had I watched the Leafs game? I played along for a few minutes. Then he said, "Dad, I've been meaning to ask, have you given any more thought to the estate stuff we talked about? Karen and I are meeting with our financial planner in December, and it would help to have a clearer picture." I said, "Actually, Daniel, I did make some changes recently." He said, "Oh yeah? Like what?" I said, "I've updated the will and restructured some things. My lawyer can provide details to the relevant parties when the time comes." There was a pause. "What does that mean, restructured?" "It means I gave it some thought," I said, and made the decisions that made sense to me. He pressed for more. I stayed calm and friendly and gave him nothing. The conversation ended with him saying he'd call me soon. He didn't call me soon. What happened next came in stages. Daniel apparently told Renee, who called me on a Tuesday evening in November. She was composed at first, then less so. She said she was worried about me. She said she hoped I hadn't made any decisions while I was emotional. I told her I had made decisions while I was clear-headed, in the office of a licensed lawyer. After several weeks of consideration, she said she thought we should all get together and talk about it as a family. I said that sounded like something we could consider. Philippe texted me that same week. His message was different from his siblings' calls, shorter, less strategic. It just said, "Dad, I heard from Daniel. I'm sorry about Thanksgiving. I should have come to Guelph. Can I call you?" I called him back. We talked for almost an hour. Of the three, Philippe is the one whose absence on Thanksgiving had hurt me the most, because he was the one I least expected. He was honest with me in a way that Daniel and Renee hadn't been. He said Karen had organized the cottage trip, and there was social pressure in the family that he hadn't resisted, and that he regretted it. I believed him not because it erased what happened, but because I know the difference between my son making an excuse and my son telling the truth. He knows the difference too. I told him I appreciated the call. I told him things were different now, but they weren't finished. Before we get to the rest of this, I want to ask you something, and I mean this genuinely. Have you ever been in a moment where someone finally sees you after a long time of not being seen? Leave me a comment. I'd love to hear where you are and what this is bringing up for you. In early December, I did something I hadn't done since Patricia was alive. I hosted a dinner party. Not for family, for friends. People from my old engineering department. A couple from the neighborhood I'd stayed close to over the years. Sylvia, Renee's friend, who had called me by accident and unknowingly told me the truth. I cooked a standing rib roast and roasted root vegetables and a butter tart square for dessert that Patricia used to make at Christmas. The table was full. The conversation was loud. Someone brought a bottle of ice wine from Niagara. We stayed at the table until almost 11, which for people our age is basically a late night. I went to bed that night feeling something I hadn't felt in some time. Not happiness exactly, something more structural than that. Like a room that has finally been arranged the way it was always supposed to be. A few days later, Margaret's office sent formal notification letters to Daniel, Renee, and Philippe. Standard practice when a will is updated and beneficiaries are affected. The letters don't detail the changes, they simply inform the named parties that an update has occurred and provide contact information if they have questions. Daniel called me within an hour of receiving his letter. He was not calm. He said this was not what Mum would have wanted. I told him his mother would have wanted her children to show up on Thanksgiving when they said they would. He said that wasn't fair. I said I agreed it wasn't. Renee called the next morning. She wanted to know if this was about the cottage. I told her it wasn't about the cottage specifically. It was about a pattern I had been watching for several years, and the cottage was simply the moment when the pattern became impossible to look away from. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I don't know when things got like this, Dad." And I believed her. Sometimes people don't know. That doesn't change what happened. I have not made any grand pronouncements to my children. I have not delivered speeches. That is not my way, and it was not Patricia's way either. What I've done is made my decisions and communicated them through the appropriate legal channels, and I've remained available to all three of them for honest conversations. Those conversations are happening now, slowly, imperfectly, the way most things in families actually happen. Philippe came to Guelph in December. We had dinner, just the two of us. I made the Cabernet Franc risotto that I'd been experimenting with. He brought a growler of dark ale from a small brewery near his apartment in Ottawa. We talked about a lot of things. His grandmother, my mother, who died when he was 12 and who he still mentions sometimes. The Pontiac in the garage that I've been slowly restoring. What he wants his life to look like in 10 years. It was the kind of dinner I had been wanting to have with one of my children for a long time. Before he left, he said, "Dad, I'm sorry I didn't fight harder." I told him I knew. I told him what mattered now was what came next. I don't know yet what comes next with Daniel. Or with Renee. That's the truth, and I think you deserve the truth at the end of this story, not a tidy resolution that I've wrapped up cleanly for you. What I can tell you is that I am not sitting in this house waiting for them. I have my counselor. I have friends. I have a half-restored 1971 Pontiac Le Mans in the garage that isn't going to finish itself. I have the garden to plan for spring. I have this community wherever you are listening from tonight. I am 64 years old, and I have probably 30 years ahead of me if I'm lucky, which at this point I think I am. Patricia didn't get her 30 years. And I think about that. I think about it when I'm tempted to waste a Saturday in resentment. I think about it when I'm in the grocery store and I stop and actually talk to someone in the produce aisle for 20 minutes about how to properly ripen a pear. I think about it when I open the wine I've been saving for a special occasion, because the occasion is today, and I am alive in it. My children made their choices last Thanksgiving. I made mine after. Neither set of choices can be unmade now. What can happen, what I am allowing to happen, is something honest on the other side of all of it. My name is Gerald Whitmore. I live in Guelph, Ontario. I set a table for 8 people and no one came. And then I decided what kind of man I wanted to be for the rest of my life. That decision, at least, was entirely my own. Thank you for listening. If this story meant something to you, I'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you have a story of your own about dignity, about family, about the choices we make when we finally see things clearly, I'd love to hear it in the comments. This is sr-sweetrevenge. And I'll see you in the next one.